After we realized that that was happening with our daughter, and then we saw it happening again with our son, we're like, "We're gonna make dentists." Like, our kids are gonna be like a dentist and an accountant just because it is the furthest thing from what mom and dad do.
Today I'm talking to Dr. Rebekah McKendry. If you're at all into horror, you may have listened to Rebekah on one of her many podcasts like Colors of the Dark and Shockwaves, or you might have seen some of her movies or some of her other work with Fangoria. I was lucky enough to act as unit production manager on one of her short films a couple of summers ago, and it's always a joy to talk to her. We talk about everything horror, from the classics to obscure movies I've never even heard of, to how her children feel growing up in a home that's always ready for a spontaneous Halloween. Hi, Rebekah. Thank you so much for joining me. It's so nice to talk to you again.
Hello, Ryan. It is so nice to talk to you again. This is awesome.
Yeah, I have to be honest. I'm a little intimidated, just because we're going to be talking about some horror, and you have a literal PhD in horror, hence the doctor in Dr. Rebekah McKendry. And I'm a little worried I won't be able to keep up. And B, among other things, you are a very successful and accomplished podcast host with multiple shows, namely Shockwaves and Colors of the Dark. So this kind of feels like a one-on-one game of basketball where you're Michael Jordan and I'm still myself.
Uh, I've lost my car keys like 3 times already today. I don't know what the hell I'm doing in life. Come on, I'm just, like,
Mhm.
poking around in the dark like everybody else. And the PhD I did because I love the genre. And so when you love something that much, it does not really seem like work. And, like, a PhD is a slog, but never once was I not excited about what I was doing. So I guess I never felt like the PhD burn of, like, having to do all of this grunt work. For me, it was just always like, yeah, I'll sit down and read about Herschel Gordon Lewis any day of the week.
Awesome. Well, I guess to start, where does your love of horror come from?
I've always had it. Like, even when I was a kid, like, I was the kid who would want to be playing, watching Scooby Doo more than anything else. And I've just always kind of gravitated towards spooky media. Like, instead of reading the Sweet Valley High books, I was reading Christopher Pike, and his, like, absolutely disturbing teen tomes. And so it's just something that's always been there. And my parents never really discouraged it in any capacity. It was rare that I was pushed away from watching something. It didn't matter how young I was. If it was something that I was interested in, they always were kind of like, yeah, sure. And they would sit me down and do that, like, overly lame parental thing where they feel like they have to explain everything's fake. That's not real blood, right? But
Mhm.
I remember being super young and picking up Piranha at my local video store.
Oh, wow.
Probably like my daughter's age, like 6 or 7, and my parents being like, "Yeah, okay, but we're gonna sit there and watch it with you." And so it was, and this is definitely they're ex-hippies. I won't even say they're ex-hippies. My mom is definitely still like hippie mentality of, you never squash a child's expression and interests, you just find a way to curb and shape them. And so that was definitely what I grew up with. My parents were not movie people. You know what? I'll take that back. My mom really likes science fiction. We watched a lot of Star Trek, and my dad will watch anything with the Duke in it, any westerns, any
Mhm.
westerny he will watch. But neither of them were in any way horror people. Mom actually kind of wasn't interested if the science fiction got too graphic or gross. But both of them were just kind of like, well, if she's into scary stuff, let's get her some scary stuff, and just kind of went with it. And in that capacity, it has always been a huge part of my life.
So do you now do the lame parental thing with your kids, or do they just kind of understand everything you would say anyway just because of the house that they live in?
So that's kind of where it went, and that's the weird thing. When I first found out I was pregnant with, my first kid, we were shopping around for a pediatrician, and when we finally decided, while I was still pregnant, I called up the pediatrician and I was like, "I have a very serious, weird question that I'm sure you don't get a lot, but I'm a horror filmmaker, who also teaches horror, and my house is basically a scrapbook to everything I've done, and there's like
Mhm.
scary shit everywhere." And how much of this do I need to take down? Do I need to, like, take everything down and go to Trader Joe's and make my house the most like vanilla thing that I possibly can? Or TJ Maxx, I mean. And my pediatrician was very kind of frank in that what kids grow up around, they're not scared of. Like, their home is going to be their home. And if something scares them, they'll tell you and then you take it down. But she said, take down anything sexual because you definitely don't want them asking questions about that yet.
Mhm.
But if, it's a werewolf, leave it. And if it scares them, they'll tell you, but by no means should you like curb who you are or change that. Like, don't, lie to the kids and say, like, mommy just makes movies and then have them later find out they're scary. And so we did our best not to curb our life in any capacity. I took down some of my like sleazier exploitation posters, but everything else stayed. And yeah, it's home to the kids, and they now are kind of almost bored with it to a degree. Where like Dave and I will be like pitching stories to each other while doing the dishes, and they're like, "Mom and Dad are talking about ghost stories again." And they're kind of annoyed, or like they'll come into the living room and I'll be watching something and I'll be like, "Are you watching another scary movie?" Like, it just, because it's what mom and dad do, it just kind of bores them. My daughter is
Mhm.
definitely, she likes witches. But like if I'm watching a creature feature or a slasher, she's just like, "Ugh, these are so boring." So it's literally just rebelling against everything I love just because it's what mom and dad do.
That's so interesting how kids' brains just work like that, and will just adapt to anything and then get bored of it.
Yeah, we kept say after we realized that that was happening with our daughter, and then we saw it happening again with our son, we're like, "We're gonna make dentists." Like, our kids are gonna be like a dentist and an accountant just because it is the furthest thing from what mom and dad do.
Oh, that's so funny. What do you think makes a great horror movie? What are the elements that go into that?
Oh, that is such a hard question. That's like
Mhm.
a whole book in itself, and everything I'd read in it would be completely wrong and disproven by somebody a year later. So I would say the biggest thing to start with is horror fans like originality, but also like to have it built on the foundation of everything that has come before. And that is a very general statement, and it's not going to be true every time, because as soon as I say that, somebody's going to blow it out of the water and give me something I've never seen before. But traditionally, if we look at something like the slasher, the reason that people say I like slashers, they all have the basic foundation. They're all kind of constructed out of the same place of, usually it's a revenge tale. Usually you're slowly picking people off, and eventually we'll discover who the killer is, but it's going to get down to one final standoff. They're structurally all the same, but within that structure is where the variety comes. We all love ghost stories, and we will watch them 10 ways to Sunday. Family moves into a new house and then there's something there. But it's in the originality, comes kind of in the ingredients that you put into that. Like, you're still making a cake, and we've all seen the cake before, but the different ingredients that you're putting into the batter is where you can really kind of entice horror fans in. But that's not always true, because if I think like, well, what foundation is something like Hereditary building off of? There's not as many things that I can directly point to. Sometimes there are, but sometimes they're not. And then it becomes a question of, do you even need to see those references to get it? No, it kind of enhances it if you watch Midsummer and say, "Oh my gosh, I see the Wicker Man and Blood on Satan's Claw," but do you have to have seen those to go in? Not a bit. The biggest thing that I think makes a good horror story is the same thing that makes a good script in general, which is characters. A lot of cases, you don't even have to have that wonderfully thought out, developed of a plot if you have a really interesting character. And even though it's not one of my favorite movies, when I teach, I always use Napoleon Dynamite as an example of this. What is the plot of Napoleon Dynamite? I don't know. It's like a guy in a high school. I think there's a dance competition at some point, and that's about all I can tell you, but I can describe his character
Right.
immensely. And so having dynamic characters, I mean, Napoleon Dynamite is definitely an over the top example of it. You don't want all your characters to be quite so over the top like that. But having characters like that where you feel them, you feel the characters, is kind of the biggest step that you can take in any script, whether it's horror or a kids movie or anything like that. And when we look back at kind of, the horror movies that made, the classics, the canons, what made them so amazing? It's still the characters. It might be the villain, but why do we love Freddy Krueger? Character work. And we can tell you everything about him. He is dynamic. We can tell you how he'll respond in particular situations, why he does certain things, what his backstory is, what his weakness is. That's all character work. And it's what makes him an interesting person to follow for a bajillion sequels and still today.
Hereditary is really interesting. That's the only scary movie I think I ever watched in a theater, and during watching the movie, I wanted them to, like, physically turn off the movie. That's the only movie I had that reaction to, and I think it's because nothing really scary happens in it for the first, like, half of it, but that whole first half is just, like, emotionally draining
It's traumatic. Yeah.
to the point that it felt like it lowered my, like, immune system to horror, and then when it kicked in, it was just too much.
So there's definitely in that capacity, the movies that I have problems getting through now are not even ones that are considered to be horror. It's things like Dogtooth or Fat Girl or Taxidermia, these ones that are just so emotionally taxing and draining to the point of bleakness. A lot of the South Korean revenge films as well. Those are the ones that I find to be kind of the most mentally troubling to get through. And Hereditary definitely channeled that for the first half of the movie and then became more traditional horror in the latter half. But where we're just looking at tragedy after tragedy and the mom having to deal with it and the family not talking and disconnecting and that unsupportive husband who just kind of takes the "I'm just going to step back and let you heal your way" approach, which was the worst approach to take at the time.
Mhm.
All of that, it structures itself very much like one of more of those like psychological dramas, and then it turns horror in the second act. And that one for me, I'm severely allergic to peanuts. So Ryan
Oh,
Turek,
no.
he texted me right before I was supposed to go in and see it, and he's like, "I don't usually give trigger warnings, but I'm going to give one to you, Becca, because there's a really severe peanut allergy in it." And I have to say, I have seen peanut allergies portrayed on screens umpteen times, and it's always like the person's inflating up like a balloon
Mhm.
and, rolling around, and and it's just pure cannot breathe the majority of the time. There's a lot more that goes into it, but her portrayal of it was spot on. And yeah, I definitely appreciated the trigger warning in that capacity because that was such an intense moment, not a scary moment in a horror sense. It was not a jump scare, it was much more like traumatically dramatic.
I sat in on one of your, classes at USC that was entirely dedicated to jump scares,
Mhm.
and there seems to be this idea that jump scares are cheap or lazy in some way. How do you react to that, and what are your thoughts?
Jump scares are an art form. Jump scares, I mean, when we look, if they are done well, they are a perfect formula of every element in the filmmaker's toolbox coming together in unison. Jump scares require sound and build and camera movement and, a very particular pacing and an editing. It is so many elements of filmmaking working perfectly in tandem to execute them. And in that, we can all name kind of what jump scares that we don't really buy, where they just did not work. We can also name movies where they're just trying to pull it. It's like jump scare after jump scare after jump scare. But being able to insert the perfect jump scare into a movie and have it be really successful, that's a fucking art form. I mean, James Wan is like next level with this shit. Mike Flanagan, and even if we look back historically, like most people can name at least one or two jump scares that really got them. And there is never a set formula. It's never like you need to swell the music here. Okay, now, take it down here and now push in with the camera or anything like that. It's very much knowing what it takes in each very specific moment to get the audience to have the stimulus that you're looking for and to have that kind of gaspy moment. And so I view tension scenes and jump scares in much the same way, where it's a fucking art form. It is a mix of a bunch of different things coming together that only an artist can craft out properly.
Mhm. Horror, much like comedy, is so subjective. Like, what scares one person may not scare another.
Mhm.
So, should writers be aiming for the broadest possible audience with their horror scripts, or is it better, do you think, to try to hone in on a niche subset of scares that might just really scare the people that will watch it?
That depends dramatically on what type of writer you are and what type
Mhm.
of script you are looking to write. So if we look at a company like Blumhouse, Blumhouse makes great films, but they all have a very specific kind of Blumhouse quality to them. They are scary. They are full of jump scares. They're always looking for that like high concept, low budget. Like it feels like there is a lot going on here, but it's basically just focused in one family. And they do feel very much kind of vanilla. They are scary, but it's a scary that can play at a mall near you. It's something that every horror fan across, America and beyond is going to want to go see. And in that, they also feel familiar. Even if we're looking at something like Insidious or Sinister, they are bringing in high concepts, and bringing in something that feels different, but it's all based on this kind of foundation of something that we've seen before. We've seen the haunted house story, we've seen the possession tale, we've seen the slasher, and those are aimed at mass audiences. So you always kind of have, the studio picture, the one that is going to be written for everyone. And those are great. And they, will turn a lot of profit. And that is, I think, probably what a lot of filmmakers aim for, because that is definitely where you're going to kind of get your biggest money makers in horror. But that said, that's not going to be every story. And what we see on the indie circuit a lot of times is smaller stories that are not going to be made for every single horror fan from 14 to 94 across the country who want to see this movie. Using an example, a recent one like Jacob's Wife just came out last week from AMP and Alliance Media Partners. And that one, directed by Travis Stevens, it's very small. It's got a quirky plot. It's scary. It's a vampire tale. And it's also a comedy. And right now, if you were just telling me that you were going to make like a dark vampire tale about she's probably in her 60s in it, 50s to 60s, older woman being the protagonist, that is not necessarily something that I would say, yes, take $100 million. Let's make it a huge studio picture. It
Mhm.
actually functions better as a small indie. And the people who will see it will kind of gravitate towards the quirkiness and the charm of it. But they both have their place. And so I definitely think it's something like, as a writer, my husband and I, we have our big studio films that we're like, okay, well, this is like a Freddy Krueger, or like something that's a massive thing that we see as kind of more widespread audience, something that could reach out. And then we have our small indie ones where I'm like, okay, it's about a tiny little werewolf in, a suburban community. This is not going to be something that is going to get seen by everyone, but it still has a place. And as an artist, a lot of times those smaller, quirky ones may even have more draw for you to create. And I find that on our capacity sometimes, like we have a big budget studio film that we've been working on, but we often get sidebarred because we get so excited about the weird stuff that is not something that we've traversed before, that is kind of completely different from everything. And so I think most writers kind of go both ways.
Do you find it difficult when you're pitching a horror project to get the people listening to you to kind of get in that headspace? Because I would just imagine that it's really hard to get a group of producers or investors in the right frame of mind for like a scary atmosphere in the pitching process, especially over Zoom now.
I find it harder for television. Like, I love film pitching because usually film pitching, it's smaller. You're in a room with like 3 to 4 people, and most of them have read the script before, which is why you are there. So they
Mhm.
understand the script, they understand the world, and then usually I will bring in like crazy amounts of visual components, and a full deck, so I feel very prepared. When you're going into television, it always feels, those are the ones where I'm like, I have no idea what's going on. Television, it's much more of a rehearsed pitch. They've usually looked at the show Bible enough to understand it, but a lot of times they are trying to fit you more into a particular kind of subset that they are trying to fill. Like, we are specifically looking for sci-fi girls age 7 to 10. And then they're trying to find a way to fit your show into that subset. And that's where I always kind of get really more antsy. And with television, it's definitely a different beast. Like, it's much more of a prepared pitch. With most of my film stuff, whenever I've pitched film, I'm in there with people who know horror, who definitely kind of feel it, as opposed to if I'm going into something like Netflix, there may be 1 or 2 horror people in the room, but I'm also looking at just general network executives who are looking more at kind of like, how many people are going to be watching this? How many eyeballs can we get on this? Well, if you make it gory, not that many. And so then it's always a question of how to keep it wide release. And so, yeah. But that said, I love pitching. That's actually, I get so amped up and perky when I pitch, to the point that
Mhm.
I sometimes have to like calm myself down ahead of time because I'm scared I'm gonna go in like all Jesse Spano and go nuts on them. But I love pitching. My husband's the exact opposite. he hates pitching. And so we tend to balance each other quite nicely in that. But yeah, we are very prepared with our pitches across the board. Like we usually start rehearsing a couple of days, if not weeks in advance. And we will literally script out the pitch and then we try to run contingencies of what questions would they be prone to ask. Like for television executives, it's always going to be like, what is the character arc of all of the characters throughout the first season? Or where is this character in season 4 as opposed to season 1? Because with television, they're always about how to keep the story going for like 10 years so that once the train, it takes a lot of work to get the train on the track and then they just want to keep it rolling. So they want to
Mhm.
have like a supernatural that's just going to keep rolling down the track. And so always trying to prepare for those questions. With film, we always think much more kind of stylistically. And the biggest thing with film we think about is how is it appropriate for each one of those companies. So like wherever we are pitching it, we are very careful about making sure that we are pitching it to what that company does. Like if I was pitching out something like Hereditary, my first place to take it might not be Blumhouse and it might not be Universal because that's just not what they do exactly. So thinking about where I want to take it that feels like, okay, this is the type of stuff they do, they will get this.
Have you noticed any recent trends in horror films or horror movie making that maybe weren't there like 10 years ago, but have kind of shifted the tide of like what's selling and getting made?
Oh yeah, it's constantly shifting. And for a lot of it, it's cyclical. Where we can look at like what was popular in the 1950s comes back in the 1980s and what was popular in the 70s came back in the early 2000s and it's coming back again now. Like everything works cyclically. And the biggest thing is once something is kind of considered to be a dead subgenre, as in like it's just not selling, you always have to have a spark. Usually on the indie circuit, you will have one film when no one else is making werewolf films. You will have one film come out that does a werewolf film that gets a little bit bigger, and then suddenly the door is open and you'll see that start enter back in. So where we have been for about the past 10 years is we've definitely been in a state of ghosts. What I call house horrors. It's not even all ghosts because even like The Purge fits into it. 5 people, one location. And we've
Mhm.
seen that even on the indie circuit. It's all about if we have one house, because it cuts budgets down, if we have one house and 5 people, what can we do there? Whether it's Ghost, whether it's something like Headcount was an indie film that came out last year that did that same setup, but did something different with it. But kind of, really kind of how do we keep it small and contained? We have not seen a lot of horror films in the last almost a decade or so that really kind of blow up in the scale that we think of in the 1980s. Like we're not going to other planets or anything like that. That's not to say that we don't have a couple that do, like Underwater Goes Underwater, of course, but they're definitely, it's just not happening with every single film. They're, for the most part, for the last decade, horror films have been contained. It's been all about kind of keeping it very contained. What we have also seen a shift of just within the past couple of years, and I seriously fucking hate this term, but what the critics call elevated horror. Elevated horror is not elevated in any capacity. It's not like, we were making dumb stuff during the late 1990s into the 2000s and now suddenly everything's a thinky piece. It's not that in any capacity. What they mean when they say elevated is it's adult problems.
It's like socially conscious horror.
Yeah, if we look back at the prior decade, we are looking at teens. We are, and especially if we look at like late 1980s into 90s, everything was Scream. It was I Know What You Did Last Summer. It was urban legend. Even as we are drifting into the 2000s with a lot of the torture porns, it's still teens. We're now tying them to chairs and like poking them with sticks for 2 hours, but it's still teens and young adults. When people are saying elevated horror, we're now shifting back towards what we had in the 1970s. In the 1970s, if we look at like Jaws, Don't Look Now, a lot of these films, they are adults going through adult shit. The Exorcist, these are all adult problems. Even The Shining, into the early 1980s. So what we're looking at when we look at something like Hereditary, Midsummer, any of these films that people are looking at and being like, oh, these are, Get Out to a degree. These are adult problems, bigger problems than just I'm a teen who was smoking up and having sex and now some killer is chasing me. They have a lot more layers and it's a lot more about, kind of the different levels of life and getting through stuff. So we've seen those come out. We've definitely seen what I'll call the A24 films, which is minimal plot but a lot of style. Like the
Mhm.
film is really built out aesthetically. Like I watched Saint Maud a couple of months ago, and a lot happens in the movie, but at the same time, not a lot happens in the movie. But what we're looking at is this
Yes.
very strong style that is infused throughout the same thing. Eyes of My Mother is a really good example on a much smaller indie level. Not a lot happens in the movie, but it has a lot of style and it has a lot to say in the moments when nothing is happening. Where we are turning now is kind of anybody's guess. If you'd asked me before the pandemic, I would have said socially conscious horror and eco horror because those were the two things that we were really seeing a lot of publicly. But the pandemic has been pretty fucking traumatic for everybody across the board. Traditionally, if we look back at horror as, kind of these cycles, anytime we have any type of national trauma, Vietnam War, 9/11, horror immediately goes hyper violent immediately afterwards. So post Vietnam War is when we get Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's when we get Last House on the Left, The Hills Have Eyes, all of these super, super hyper violent movies. Like we're just really trying to push ourselves as far as we can for catharsis. And the same thing we see after 9/11. We get Saw, we get Hostel, we get this return to these torture films, really just pushing our own brains as far as we can as a form of catharsis. I have no idea if this pandemic is going to be, that level of national trauma or where this is going to kind of head. I've read critics who say that now everything is going to be about containment. And I could see that because our horror right now is kind of being stuck inside for another year.
Mhm.
And I don't think it will be illness horrors. I've seen a couple people say like, "Oh, well, it's all gonna be contagion horrors." We're not usually that on the nose with it.
And I think everyone's so sick of talking about
Yeah, I
that.
have a feeling that that is not gonna be where we head, but how kind of this rests psychologically, I don't know. We've never really been through a pandemic in kind of, a heavy media time period before, so kind of where we're gonna gravitate to filmically now, I am so excited to see because horror fans tend to work out our demons through horror, and it very much becomes a cathartic thing where, which is part of why we can see horror waxing and waning as, we do have these national tragedies. And yeah, so where we head now, I have no idea. I do have a feeling, and this is much more on a logistical financial level, people are kind of nervous going back in right now. So, what I am seeing is a lot of horror films being bought and sold, but definitely on a much more kind of lower scale. Because we don't know when theaters are going to open back up or if audiences are going to go back to theaters is a big question. I am
Mhm.
not seeing as many people push $7 million horror films as I am $700,000 films because we're all kind of unsure of how our money making strategy will be going forward.
Interesting, because yeah, I'm always, like, so aware of the small budget horrors that are made to turn a big profit, but now we're gonna seemingly go from small budget to, like, micro budget horrors.
Exactly. And so the question is like, well, I mean, most of the films that we've seen recently that we think of as being huge budget, they're actually still pretty contained. I mean, even if we're
Mm,
thinking about Get Out, it is still primarily one location, five actors. It may have some bigger set pieces. There may be moments where more actors come in and out, but those are like 2 day shoots. It is still a relatively, I would say, below like $7 million film. But even those I have not been seeing as much of as of late getting greenlit. I have seen a lot of television because we watched television like crazy during the pandemic. So I've seen a lot of television getting greenlit, and then I've seen a lot of smaller stuff. Right now, Hollywood is in constant conversations about the theaters because if you're making a small $700,000 horror film, a theater might be a luxury. It's something that cool. We get to do a limited theatrical. That is awesome. It is another revenue stream, but it's not going to be your biggest one. Your biggest one's still going to be the VOD channels. But if you are making $100 million Guillermo del Toro epic, you have to be able to release to theaters globally. And so right now it's shaky so much across the board, and our biggest question domestically is, are people going to go back to theaters? Now that the day that nobody released to theaters a couple of weeks ago, I watched it on my TV at home. As soon as like Raya and the Last Dragon, one of the big Disney films of the year released. I watched it at home with my kids in my pajamas that night. There is a luxury to that. And so the idea of somebody getting off their couch to go see the new Godzilla King of the Monsters, had it been in theaters, it's a big question right now. Do people prefer to watch stuff at home now? Are they just going to wait for it? And we don't know.
Mhm.
And what's sad is all around Los Angeles, we've been seeing theaters close. And even just, even in my hometown back in Virginia, we lost two theaters. There were only four in the town, but two of them closed during the pandemic. And so, it's just kind of at this point in a state of slipperiness that no one really knows where it's going. So everybody's being kind of conservative with the budgets right now in horror, from what I've seen, especially on the film side.
Mhm. Before I let you go, I kind of just want some horror recommendations from the doctor of
Oh, good
horror.
lord.
Are there any? What are some great recent horror movies that you've seen that you think people should check out? And is there anything coming out soon that you're excited
I'm
for?
excited to see Antlers. I really like the team behind that one, so I'm really excited to see Antlers. But recent ones that I've seen that I was just like, "Oh my god, that's awesome." Spontaneous was my favorite film of last year. It is loosely a horror film. I mean, it is very, very gory, but I've heard people say, "Yeah, but it's a romance to a degree." For me, it's a straight up horror film. So I highly recommend Spontaneous. That movie
Okay.
was my perfect pandemic film. And it made me cry. And then I remember tweeting about it, and so many of the horror fans that I interact with online had not seen it because the cover of it makes it look like a romance film. And then every single one of them was like, "Holy shit, this movie changed me. This was like the horror film of the year." And it is. It's great. I highly recommend Spontaneous. Recent ones that I have watched, Queen of Black Magic was good. I love international, so Terrified is on Shutter right now. Queen of Black Magic is on Shutter right now. I'm just really fascinated with a lot of what is going on in the international space because it's doing something drastically different than what we've been doing here in the States. The Wind was really good. That was last year. Very small, self-contained, one location, cast of four. Really good. Seder. I just watched Seder a couple of nights ago, and that was like one filmmaker who was like a one man band. Like he did everything. He was his DP, and it's basically just him and his grandmother for most of the film. And he used his actual grandmother in it. And there is just
Wow.
something so haunting and captivating by it about it. Very cheap, not going to be for everybody, but I really enjoyed it. Other big ones that I saw recently, The Toll. I really liked that one is on Amazon now. That one I liked. It's small, but it feels like there could have been a big studio version for it. It sets up this character, this kind of mythic horror villain called the Toll Man that I really enjoyed. Even just looking back at last year, right before the pandemic hit, I went to Panic Fest and I saw Sea Fever there. That was definitely one from last year. It's an Irish horror film. I love aquatic horror.
Oh yeah, that one's been on my watch list on Letterboxd for a
It's
while.
so good. Again, small, 5 people, 1 boat. Might be 6, but yeah, it's got some really cool effects in it, and I absolutely love the creature. On a much bigger budget scale, I loved Underwater last year. It was just my wonderful that is the type of movie that I want to see in a theater because it was massive and it just everything was all about scope and explosions and rushing to the next set piece and massive scenes, and it just was a wonderful viewing experience in a theater.
I'm so excited to look up all these movies that I have never ever heard about.
Well, I'm glad I could give you some new ones that you haven't seen before.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Okay, well, I want to thank you again so much for taking the time to talk to me. And where can people find you and your work?
I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook just under Rebekah McKendry. You can find me through Fangoria's Colors of the Dark podcast. And otherwise, I'm a filmmaker. And so you can definitely check out some of my past films. But I have a new one that I'm shooting in 2 months that I'm really excited about. So hopefully, we will be releasing info on that soon.
Awesome. Well, thank you again.
Yes. Thank you so much, Ryan. Have a great afternoon.
You too. You can find more of the show at Hollywood Greenhorn on Instagram and at GreenhornPod on Twitter. And you can find more of my work at ryanfitzgerald.org. Send an email anytime to hollywoodgreenhornshow@gmail.com. Check out the other episode up now, where I talk to producer David Lawson, where we discuss, among other things, how he passed on making Hereditary. And come back next week when I talk to award-winning writer and director Amy Simons.